It's like showing up to a card game and losing the table, the chairs, and the house itself. Except the cards were blades, and the house was an empire. Something happened in the Philippine archipelago that colonial records were careful to understate. Not erase, they couldn't afford to look that afraid, but understate, yes, minimize, reframe. A fighting tradition so effective that the men sent to suppress it became its most reluctant proof of concept. 3 generals, gone. And after that, a ban, not on weapons, not on armies, but on movement itself, on the way a body learned to kill. What do you ban when you can't defeat it? That question has haunted historians for centuries, and the answer the Spanish gave in the Philippines tells us something extraordinary about what they encountered there. To understand the prohibition, you have to understand what came before it. Long before any European vessel crested the horizon of the Visayan Sea, the people of the archipelago had already built a sophisticated culture of combat, not war for war's sake, something more layered than that. The Filipino warrior tradition, what we now call arnis or eskrima or kali, depending on who is speaking and from which island, was never simply a fighting system. It was a philosophy encoded in muscle memory, a way of reading the world through the language of angles and timing and the space between heartbeats. The blades they trained with had names. The movements had names. The masters who carried this knowledge passed it through lineages as carefully as a priest passes scripture. This was oral tradition written in the body. And then the Spanish arrived. Ferdinand Magellan reached the Philippines in 1521. History remembers him. What history tends to soften or gloss over with vague praise for native resistance is just how badly that initial encounter should have recalibrated everything the Spanish thought they knew about conquest. Magellan died at the Battle of Mactan. He didn't merely lose, he died in shallow water, surrounded by warriors who refused to be impressed by European steel. Lapu-Lapu. Say that name out loud. The chieftain of Mactan stood against a force of armored conquistadors, men in metal, men with firearms, men who had already subdued entire populations across 2 oceans, and he turned them back. Magellan didn't fall to superior numbers alone. He fell because the men opposing him moved differently. They understood angles that European sword training hadn't considered. They could close the distance before a longer weapon could be brought to bear. They could fight with empty hands when the blade was gone. They transitioned between weapons and between the presence and absence of weapons, like water changing between states. That fluidity, that was the thing. European martial traditions of the 16th century were largely linear. You advanced, you pressed, you relied on reach and armor and the psychological effect of a disciplined line. Filipino fighting traditions, developed across centuries of inter-island conflict, had evolved to deal with unpredictable terrain, multiple opponents, and an opponent who might be armed with anything from a long spear to a short blade to nothing at all. The system, if we can even call it one system, was modular, adaptive, built not around a specific weapon, but around principles that could be applied to any weapon. Wait a second. That distinction matters enormously. When you train for a specific weapon against a specific opponent in a specific context, you become brittle when any of those variables change. When you train for principles, for understanding distance, timing, angle, and flow, you become dangerous in every context. The Spanish, for all their military sophistication, were largely brittle. The Filipino warriors they encountered were not. Magellan's death was logged as a setback. The colonial project continued, but something had been noted, quietly, in the accounting ledgers of empire. The Spanish returned. They established Manila in 1571. They began the long, grinding process of bringing the archipelago under colonial administration. To be honest, and for a time, they managed it, through alliance, through conversion, through trade incentives, and when those failed, through force. The lowland Christian communities of Luzon and the Visayas were gradually brought under Spanish governance. Mission networks expanded. Churches rose where animist shrines had stood. But the fighting knowledge didn't disappear. It went sideways. This is where the story gets complicated in ways that conventional colonial history doesn't quite capture. The Spanish were not dealing with a centralized military that they could defeat in a single engagement and then dismantle. There was no singular Filipino army. There were warriors, distributed, local, embedded in communities, carrying their knowledge in their bodies rather than in any document that could be confiscated. The system of combat was socially invisible in exactly the way that made it impossible to eliminate by conventional means. You can burn a library. You cannot burn what a man has practiced 10,000 times until his nervous system knows it without asking. And that practice continued. Under colonial rule, it continued. Sometimes in plain sight, disguised as dance, embedded in festivals, encoded in games that looked recreational to an untrained eye. The movements were there. The principles were alive. The transmission went on.
Military engagements with resistant communities kept producing the same troubling pattern. Their men, even experienced soldiers, kept dying in close-quarter situations where they should have had every advantage. The armored advantage disappeared the moment fighting became personal, the moment distance collapsed and the engagement turned to the kind of intimate, lethal geometry that Filipino warriors had been refining for generations. Moving on. And then came the generals. Look, the specific number, 3, is significant not as a clean statistic, but as a threshold. One general dying in colonial warfare is a tragedy that gets a footnote. 2 is a pattern that gets a meeting. 3 is a crisis that gets a policy. The deaths of 3 high-ranking Spanish officers in engagements where Filipino fighting techniques played a decisive role, in close quarters, in ambushes, in situations where European tactical doctrine was simply outmaneuvered, reached the ears of the colonial administration at a level where decisions were made not just about strategy, but about what the empire could afford to allow its subjects to know. Here is the thing about banning a fighting system. It is an act of profound acknowledgement. You don't ban something that doesn't frighten you. Stop. The colonial authorities issued edicts restricting the practice of indigenous fighting arts in various forms across the occupied territories. The specifics varied by region and by decade. Colonial policy was never monolithic, and the archipelago's geography made uniform enforcement a fantasy. But the intent was clear enough. What the Spanish could not defeat militarily, they attempted to defeat culturally. If the practice could be pushed underground, truly underground, invisible even in its concealment, perhaps it would eventually die of its own absence. It didn't. Important. The practitioners did what they had always done. They adapted. The dances grew more elaborate. The festivals became more detailed. The movements that carried killing knowledge were wrapped in the costume of entertainment, and the entertainment was performed for Spanish eyes by Filipino bodies that knew exactly what they were doing. Sinulog, Sayao, Cariñosa, these are not simply dances. They are vessels. They carried something through the centuries that was not supposed to survive. There is a philosophical question hiding in here that I find I can't quite let go of. What happens to knowledge when it is forced to become secret? Does it become purer, more concentrated? Does the act of hiding something, truly hiding it with genuine stakes, with the understanding that discovery brings real consequences, does that act change the nature of the thing being hidden? Wait a second. The practitioners of Eskrima during the colonial period weren't simply preserving a fighting technique. They were preserving an identity, a worldview. a way of understanding the body's relationship to space and time and the presence of danger. The colonial project was not merely political, it was epistemological. The Spanish were not just trying to govern the Philippines, they were trying to replace how Filipinos understood themselves. Look, the fighting system was resistance to that replacement at the most fundamental level. Muscle memory is older than language. It is older than politics. You can ban a word, you can replace a name, you can insist on a new god and a new calendar and a new way of marking time. But you cannot reach into a body and undo what 10,000 hours of practice have written there. If you found this channel because you care about stories that get buried, subscribe. The Echoes of Ancients series goes to places that textbooks tend to walk past. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that changes the shape of everything said before it. The ban, as it turns out, was not only unsuccessful, it was counterproductive in a way that the colonial administrators could not have predicted and probably would not have believed even if someone had tried to explain it to them. Because the act of banning the fighting arts forced the practitioners into a mode of preservation that was, paradoxically, more robust than open practice would have been. When something is practiced openly, it is practiced casually. Standards drift. Knowledge gets diluted by practitioners who are competent but not committed. Social pressure keeps most people within a conventional range of ability. When something is practiced in secret, when the stakes of practice are genuine, when the transmission requires trust, when every student is selected for character and commitment before being selected for physical ability, the tradition becomes extremely dense. Think of it like pressure on carbon. Open practice is graphite. Forced secrecy is diamond. Now pay attention. The masters who taught under colonial prohibition were not teaching everyone. They were teaching the right people. The standards were higher precisely because the consequences of failure, of teaching someone who would expose the tradition, of passing knowledge to someone whose character couldn't hold it, were existential. This kind of selection pressure, maintained over generations, produces something extraordinary. And it did. Important. The specific lineages that survived the colonial period carried techniques that were, if anything, more refined than what had been practiced before. Not more elaborate. Refinement is not elaboration. More distilled. The unnecessary had been removed by the pressure of secrecy. What remained was functional, pure, tested not in tournaments, but in the actual conditions for which the system was designed. Now pay attention. The Spanish, in trying to kill Eskrima, may have made it sharper. There is something almost unbearably ironic in that.
The empire that sent soldiers to suppress a fighting tradition accidentally created the conditions that would preserve that tradition in its most lethal form. Not through conspiracy, through the ordinary blundering logic of power trying to control what it fears and succeeding only in concentrating it. All right, the prohibition also created something else, a mythology. And mythology, in many ways, is more durable than practice. The stories of masters who moved so quickly that Spanish soldiers couldn't track the blade, who transitioned from stick to knife to empty hand in a single flowing moment that looked to the uninitiated like a kind of magic. Those stories traveled. They traveled between islands. They traveled across generations. They became the connective tissue of a cultural identity that the colonial project was simultaneously trying to dissolve. You wanted to erase us. You made us legendary instead. Consider what the post-colonial period eventually revealed about these lineages. When Eskrima and Arnis began to emerge more openly in the 20th century, when Filipino martial arts began to gain international attention, when practitioners from outside the Philippines began to train in the system and found themselves confronted with a tradition of extraordinary sophistication, the assumption in some quarters was that this had been preserved in a kind of amber, an artifact, a historical curiosity. It wasn't. The system was alive, Well, it had continued to evolve, even in hiding. The principles that had confounded Magellan's soldiers in 1521 were still there, still functional, still adaptive, still carrying within them the essential insight that had made the tradition dangerous to an empire, that the principles of effective combat transcend any specific tool or context, and that a practitioner trained in those principles cannot be made irrelevant simply by changing the circumstances of engagement. That insight is not just a martial insight, it is a cultural one. A people who have internalized the principle that adaptation is more powerful than rigidity, that flowing with the nature of a situation is more effective than imposing a predetermined structure upon it, are not a people who can be fully colonized, even when they are politically occupied. The fighting philosophy and the cultural philosophy were always the same philosophy. The Spanish understood this dimly, which is why the ban was issued. They understood it dimly, which is why the ban was insufficient. Now here is the question I've been holding back. Here is the one that changes the shape of everything else. What if the ban was the plan? Not a Spanish plan, a Filipino one. Stay with this for a moment before you dismiss it. There are oral traditions within certain Eskrima lineages that suggest something extraordinary, that the masters of the colonial period deliberately provoked the Spanish prohibition.
Let's say that they understood what the ban would do, that it would force the tradition underground into conditions of secrecy that would produce exactly the kind of selective, high-pressure transmission that would make the art stronger and more concentrated over time. That they saw the Spanish response coming and used it. That the dance disguise wasn't simply a survival mechanism improvised under pressure. It was a design choice made ahead of the prohibition by practitioners who understood with a kind of strategic clarity that is almost impossible to fully appreciate from this distance, that an empire can occupy a land but cannot occupy a philosophy. And that a philosophy hidden inside a celebration is a philosophy that will outlast any empire. If that is true, and we cannot verify it, the oral traditions are not signed confessions, then the story is not about victims surviving suppression. It is about strategists who outthought an empire across multiple generations, who accepted the short-term cost of the ban in exchange for the long-term certainty that what they were protecting would endure. 3 generals died. The Spanish panicked. They issued a prohibition, and in doing so, they may have done exactly what the masters of Kali wanted them to do. The forbidden combat system wasn't just preserved despite the ban, it may have been sharpened because of it, and the people who engineered that outcome may have understood exactly what they were doing, centuries before the empire fell, centuries before arnis became the national martial art of the Philippines in 2009, centuries before Filipino fighting techniques became studied and respected across the world. They were not playing defense, they were playing a longer game than the Spanish could see, and the moves, they still work.